Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenan de Leeuw. I am the chair of APRA, the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research Association. We are a non-profit academic association here in Amsterdam with a focus on education about psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, and many more. And also different methods and practices in alteration of consciousness, including meditation, breathwork, and several other ways that the mind and consciousness can be affected. And we always really try to offer different perspectives from an interdisciplinary viewpoint, right? Because these substances and these practices can be so interesting to study from many different academic disciplines. And we are very excited to have this introductory talk here today. Sometimes we offer lectures and journal clubs that are a bit more catered to people who are a bit further down the rabbit hole, so to say. But we also think, especially in the times that we're living in now, where there's so much interest in psychedelics, and actually kind of a lack of high-quality education about them here at the universities, right? Like on university curricula, with some exceptions. I'm going to mention that in a moment. It's actually quite limited how much discussion is currently going on about psychedelics in medicine, psychology, neuroscience, in very relevant fields. And I guess there's kind of a gap there, and that's one of the original goals that APRA was founded. And we're very happy to be able to offer events like this to, give people a bit more insight into this very rapidly expanding and very interesting field of study. So thank you all for being here today, and I'm very happy that I can introduce our guest speaker, Josjan Zijlmans. I'm not going to give him like the full academic bio, because I think he can do that far better himself, but I will say that he is a researcher at the Amsterdam University Medical Center, where he's, among other things, involved in a study for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD in adolescents. He's also an assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit here in Amsterdam, where he offers actually one of the few really university accredited courses on psychedelics, drugs that alter your mind, which is also the title of this talk here, which is quite unique because there's, as I mentioned, very few actual courses that you can follow in the Netherlands that are specifically dedicated to psychedelics. We're very happy to have him here. And just a very brief note on the program. The first section of this event will be Josjan's talk, giving us a bit of an overview about psychedelics. How do they work? What potential do they have? There will be a short break, 5 minutes in between, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards where we'll be sitting down here and I'll be asking him some questions, and we'll open it up to the audience, and you can ask him anything you like. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to give a warm round of applause for Josjan Zijlmans. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Perfect. So I will not say much more about my academic career. I think Eden gave you the main points. That's good. In addition to working at Amsterdam UMC, I work at Level, which is the child psychiatry in Amsterdam, where we're setting up this study to treat adolescents with MDMA. And my research is funded by the Make MDMA Foundation, or Make MDMA Medicine Foundation, and a grant by Zon&W. And I work in Amsterdam, but I live in Rotterdam. And I learned 2 days ago that Rotterdam Central Station was closed today. So I had to take the subway to The Hague, and then I took a train to Amsterdam South, and then I took the subway. So I had a 2.5-hour trip to get here, which was not nice, but also fine. So I'm happy to still be here and see so many of you guys, and give you some introduction into psychedelics. So what I'll try to do is cover sort of the basics of many things that are going on, and with where the clinical trials more or less are headed, as that seems to be what people are generally most interested in. And then we have so much time for questions, so please let me know what you're interested in afterwards, and we can discuss many different things. Okay, and I show you a nice picture every now and then because it draws your attention back to the screen. Very effective. Okay, so back when people still wrote letters to each other, people came up with the term psychedelics. And it was actually two people writing to each other. It was Aldous Huxley, whom you may know. He was a very famous author, wrote A Brave New World. And he wrote to this other guy To make this trivial world sublime, take half a gram of phanerothym, which is a nice rhyme and it sounds kind of sweet, but you have never heard of phanerothym before in your life, I assume, and therefore you must conclude that this was not the best rhyme, which is true, because the other guy, Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist who was working with psychedelics as one of the pioneers, you could say, wrote back to him and he said, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic," which is, I think, more beautiful. And it stuck. And since this happened somewhere in the 50s, I think, and as of that point, more or less, we started using this term psychedelic, which means as much as to manifest the mind or manifest the soul. There's many more interpretations, but I think it has a nice ring to it. So we can work with it for now. And the question what psychedelics are is actually becoming more or less complicated. It used to be pretty straightforward, where we had this group of substances like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, 2CB, that all have a more or less similar action in the brain and also produce more or less similar psychoactive experiences in people. So they're very similar substances which we used to call psychedelics, and we still do. But as research has been progressing, or since research has been catching up again, we've been including much more different substances under the same header, including MDMA, which I promise you has very different psychoactive properties from classical psychedelics, but nonetheless, we now more or less see it as the psychedelic which is furthest ahead in research. We now tend to include ketamine into the psychedelic category, even though ketamine is actually a tranquilizer and has been used for many, many years already for medicine, but really as a tranquilizer and not as sort of a therapeutic compound. And nowadays, people even say that cannabis might have psychedelic properties. And there's something to say for this, because all these substances produce, you could say, profound or at least very potent effects in people's experiences. But what does or doesn't make them psychedelic is not quite clear. For the talk, assume that generally I'm talking about these three substances, LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, because they are most researched, most commonly used, most relevant. And I'll try to denote when I differ to something else. To start with, let's cover sort of the basic qualities of what psychedelics do. And sort of I try to sum them up, but one problem with explaining psychedelics is that it's really hard to define the experience and explain what the experience is like. So I'll try to get through it and then hope to give you a small sense of an idea about it. So the first is effects on sensory perception. And most commonly, or most known, I think, are the visual effects. You have all these psychedelic movies, psychedelic visuals, psychedelic pictures. You must have seen plenty of them. They give some sense of how psychedelics affect your perception visually. But it actually has an effect on all your perceptions. Your audio is changed. Your sense of perception is changed in the sense that you're feeling things differently. Your body feels differently. Your proprioception is changed. Everything differs when you're high, you could say. I'll give a few examples of the visual perceptions in a second. The other sort of prominent thing is effects on time perception. Generally, people have the feeling that time slows down on psychedelics. So a trip might last, let's say, 5 or 6 hours or so, but it might feel as if it's taken an entire day, or on high doses even a week or something. So these can be very, very potent changes to your sense of time. Then there's effects on cognition. If you would sum it up, you could say that your convergent thinking or your sort of rational thinking is somewhat hampered. It's harder to do simple things. It is harder to think logically. The general takeaway is don't try to cook pasta while you're high, because it's really, really complicated, even though it's very simple. But on the other hand, your effects on divergent thinking, so your associative thinking, your creative thinking, seem to be very much enhanced. People report much more creativity on psychedelics. Many people have claimed that some of their inventions were due to psychedelic experiences, including the invention of the helix of DNA. And Steve Jobs, I think, has claimed that he came up with Apple whilst high on LSD. If this is true, it's not completely clear. I'm not sure if it's the best example, but people claim it. So it's clear people have these associations that make it very creative and very inspirational. Then there's effects on emotion, which again are very, very broad. People tend to have very euphoric, very happy periods in their trips. Generally, these are the largest portions of experiences are generally positive, but people can also have terrifying, anxious experiences. And some people argue that emotions in general are enhanced during psychedelic trips. And then some people say, well, it actually has effects on consciousness. So it's an altered state of consciousness when you are high on psychedelics. Just as, let's say, sleeping is a different state of consciousness, and dreaming is another state. And you can sort of imagine that there's all these variants, and the psychedelic state would be one of them. And I would argue that that is actually more or less the same thing than just summing up all those things, because all your experiences together more or less would form your conscious experience. And I think it's telling that if you sort of look at all these things, then it's essentially everything, right? There's not much in your experience that wouldn't fall under this category at some point. So really, the way you experience the world, the way you experience yourself is very heavily altered, very much different from your usual experiences of reality. Show you a few pictures. So this is from an artist who draws pictures based on his DMT trips. People find the eye sometimes very unnerving, but I find it quite pleasing. And what's nice about psychedelic, or well, maybe not per se nice, but what's typical is that people tend to think that psychedelics cause hallucinations, where you see things that are not there, but rather the visual effects and also the other sensory effects are more like illusions, where they change things, but it's not so much that you see things that are not there. So you see that, it's still clearly a wolf and there's water, and you can see what is what, but it's changing around. And here's just one other example of that. And I figured these are actually not the most beautiful pictures, so I found a video to give you a more particular sense of what it might look like. This is a fairly realistic depiction of what you might see whilst being high on psychedelics. And you can see that you can still differentiate well between the path and the trees and these buildings. But they're shifting somewhat. The light is very much changing. And you see things moving around a lot. Some people report that things seem to be breathing. If you're interested in this, there's like 1,000 videos like this on YouTube, so look them up if you want to see more. And there's many variants of this, but I think it's a good idea of how things are altered, but not per se completely hallucinated. All right. So that covers more or less the general or the basic effects. And then the two things that have been noted since, 60, 70 years ago to be of great importance for how the experience plays out are called set and setting. And these two are quite straightforward concepts, which should be familiar in the sense that these things are generally important to how you experience the world. But they refer to the one thing, your mindset, your internal state, the mental state that you have when you would take a psychedelic. So you can imagine that it might be a very different trip when you're excited and you're curious and you're wondering what might happen, or if you're anxious and despaired and you don't really know what's going on. So what you start out with will influence what the trip will be like in general, which I'd say makes sense in regards of other experiences as well. But it's much stronger, you could say, with psychedelic experiences. And then the setting refers to the environment in which you take a psychedelic. And here you can consider how many people are there. Are you at home with a few good friends and there's some person there who is sober who can talk to you if you feel uncomfortable? That's a very different way, and you could say a much more relaxed way, I think, than if you're, let's say, at some festival with 10,000 other people who are doing drugs. It might be more overwhelming, more chaotic, more complicated to get into a nice experience. So both the internal state and the external state are very important in changing the experience, in forming the experience. All right. So I always show this video in talks because I think it's a nice representation of how people are actually, or what people are actually like on psychedelics. So this is from the 50s, and this is it's the early days in research where people haven't really worked with LSD yet, other than just giving healthy people LSD to see what it does. So what you see here is a healthy woman, taking a psychedelic with a psychiatrist present, and he's just talking to her during the experience. And I'll show the video first, and then we can talk about it a little bit. I'll show 3 minutes of it.
If you weren't here, and if nobody else, yes, everything is one. You have nothing to do with it. I am one with what I am. I can see everything in color. Everything. You have to see the air. You can't believe it. And the dimensions and all the prisms and the rays and everything coming down through you and moving.
What does this all mean to you?
I've never seen such infinite beauty in my life. It's like a curtain or a spider web. Can you see it? It's right here in front of me, right now. Watch. No. Good heavens. You know what went through me? It passed right through me.
Could you feel it?
Me? There isn't any me.
Is all this pleasant or unpleasant? Or aren't these the right words?
What seems pleasant or unpleasant? There isn't anything pleasant or unpleasant. It's too beautiful. It's how can you think and I mean, can't you feel it? Everything is so beautiful and lovely and alive. You shouldn't say anything about anything not being. This is reality. This is. If you look right over there, are you looking? Can you?
Yes, what should I see?
I wish I could talk in Technicolor, or let you see. Can you? Did you say you can see it?
No, I can't quite see it. Tell me about it.
I can't tell you about it. If you can't see it, then you'll just never know it. I feel sorry for you.
All right, so I love this video for very many reasons. One is that I think it very nicely shows how calm people generally are. I don't think if you would ask a random person who's not very aware of what psychedelics do, what a person would look like taking LSD, I don't think this would be an apt description, right? She's quite relaxed, she can talk about the experience, she can connect to the other person. It's very relaxed, you could say. Also fascinating, I think, is that she's clearly enjoying it. She finds it so beautiful, and still she finds it so hard to communicate to him what that might mean or what it does entail, right? And he's trying to get this out of her, and I think he's doing a good job of it in the sense of he's being relaxed, he's not pressuring her to talk or something, but it's very hard for them to get sort of common ground on what is going on. And she's also distracted, right? At some point she's looking at him, and then she's just sort of looking at something else, and again, realizing how beautiful everything is. just like this. So I think it's an apt way of getting a little bit of sense of what people are like during the experiences. And of course, this is just one example, and there's thousands more, but just to give you a little bit of sense. And one point, of course, here is that it's not that she's going to jump out of any window soon, right? Which is sort of still the sort of stigmatized idea of what psychedelics might entail or what LSD might do, is you lose your mind and you jump out of the window thinking you can fly. This never really happens, right? So it's a good realization that this is more accurate in that sense. All right. So having had the basic effects, I want to continue a little bit into to usage of psychedelics. So we do a little test. If you can all raise your hand. Thank you. Don't worry, it's the only interactive part until you can ask questions. Okay, so keep your hand raised if you ever used caffeine. Everyone? You never drank tea? Ah, yes. See? Everyone. Okay, everyone used caffeine. Probably one of the oldest, most important psychoactive compounds we still use on a highly daily basis. Okay, keep your hand raised if you ever drank alcohol. Okay, we lose one or two usually, yeah. Okay. Keep your hand raised if you ever smoked weed, used marijuana, space cake, any of that. Okay, we lost one person, I think. You're very much on the high order in this. Keep your hand raised if you ever used MDMA. Okay, we lose more now, down to maybe half or so. And keep your hand raised if you ever used a classical psychedelic like psilocybin, LSD. Okay, we switch up a little bit, but otherwise it remains the same. Okay, thank you. This always gives stuff to talk about in the break as well, if you want to. So you are very high on the drug use spectrum, which is generally the case when I give these talks. But still, there's many people who haven't used MDMA or psilocybin and are still interested to hear about it, apparently, right? So if we put this a little bit in perspective, the Netherlands are very high in drug use. So I'll show you the rates for the Netherlands from 1 or 2 years ago. So MDMA, 4% of adults used MDMA in the past year. 1 in 25 people, right? So that should have been 2 or 3 of you in the past year. If you look at psilocybin, magic mushrooms, it's 1%. Truffles, 0.8%. LSD, 0.4%. And ayahuasca, which is like this Amazonian brew, which has DMT in it, only 0.1%. It very much differs per audience whether you feel these are high or low, but generally people, at least my students, are always surprised that it's so low, but that's because they're students and they use a lot of drugs and old people don't. But these are the numbers for the Netherlands, and worldwide they are lower than this, right? One reason being that the Netherlands has, well, not really lax drug policies, but at least truffles are, for example, legal. It's relatively easy to find drugs in the Netherlands, and the use of it is decriminalized. Okay. Why I asked this and why I show this is to relate a little bit to you guys, but also to relate it then to the next picture, which is a famous study by now from 15 years ago from a professor in England. And he did this study where he compared the harms of all different drugs. And he had this rated by like medical doctors and healthcare specialists and people like this. I won't go through the entire thing, but it's just to point out a few basic things. So on the y-axis, you see the overall harm score. It's a complicated story how this is calculated exactly, but generally the higher it is, the more harmful the thing is. And then here you see all these different drugs. And there's all these different types of harm that are being included. So blue on top is dying because of the drug. Red is dying due to the drug. So let's say if you die of alcohol poisoning, then it's because of the drug. And if you kill yourself whilst driving drunk, then it's due to the drug. And there's all these different categories. And then interestingly, what you see is that the most dangerous one is alcohol, according to the study at least. And then here we have tobacco. And here, all the way down, we have ecstasy, LSD, and magic mushrooms, the stuff that we're interested in here. And this is a strange situation where these things that are completely legal and you can buy anywhere are actually fairly harmful in many ways you can measure. But then these things that are highly illegal, at least MDMA and LSD, are completely illegal. They're the worst kind of drugs according to the law. but actually, if you look at the data, then they're relatively harmless. Of course, this is not to say there's no risks and you can just do them and see what happens, but relative to other things, there's less risks involved. And I want to sort of explicate this point with one more example, and then we will go to sort of the history and the clinical part, which is another study by the same guy from the year before, actually, where he compared to give sort of a sense of how dangerous drugs actually are. He compared ecstasy, so MDMA, I'm not sure if you can read this well, but don't worry, I'll guide you through it, to this new drug called Ecstasy, which is a new designer drug which was just on the market. And we're not going to go through the entire table, just the top row. So it says here, acute harm to person, which is basically you take the drug and something goes wrong, you need to go to the ER. Yeah, this is sort of the level of harm we're talking about. So with ecstasy, about 1 in every 10,000 times, it goes wrong in the sense that people need medical help to be okay. It's not that they die or something, but they need to go to the doctor and then afterwards are generally fine. So once every 10,000 times, how harmful do you guys feel this is? Very harmful, little harmful, in between harmful? Low?
It depends what harm is.
Yeah, so let's say it's as harmful as like breaking your leg or something. Very unpleasant, you won't die from it. These kinds of things. Okay, you're generally low, or the rest of you are like, just give us the answer. Okay, I'll give you the answer. I agree that it's low, I think. But of course, relevant is the comparison. The comparison is to this other drug, which is harmful once in every 350 episodes. So if you would compare them directly, it's about 30 times as dangerous to do the other drug. How do you feel about this one? Of course, more dangerous, but is it still low, or is it now like, I'm not sure if I want to try this? You don't want to talk about it, that's okay. I'm just going to tell you what generally people say. People generally say, this is too much. I don't want to try this drug. It's too harmful. You know, it might be fun, but let's just not do it. And people say, this is doable. I can deal with once in every 10,000 times. You know, if you're careful, you're probably not in that group. Okay. And then the clue of this story is that the comparison is actually not between two drugs, but it's between one drug, MDMA, and one activity. So this ecstasy, any guesses what the activity is? You know the study. Okay, then you shouldn't. But you can say it if you want.
It's horse riding?
Yes, it's horseback riding. Okay, so now we have a new comparison, right? We thought we were talking about these two drugs, but actually we're talking about, would you rather have your, let's say, 15-year-old daughter go ride a horse every week? Or would you let her have MDMA every week? And I think if you ask this question, generally people would say, well, definitely horseback riding, which there's still much to say for this. But if you just look at it statistically, it's much more likely that a person will be seriously hurt riding a horse than that they will be seriously hurt doing MDMA. And here again, this is not to say there's no risks. There is definite risks, and every now and again someone dies from doing MDMA very stupidly. You know, this happens. There's definitely incidents. But the comparison is important because it gives some sense of how dangerous things are and how we compare things, and especially that we're not being realistic about dangers when we talk about drugs in general, right? No one is talking about the dangers of horseback riding generally, but in the sense of statistics, it's important. So just as a takeaway, you can mull this over a little bit. Nice picture. All right. Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's even 1 in 10,000 times though. I should look that up. People always ask me how bad is driving a car, and I still haven't looked it up. So I'm going to do that at some point. Yeah. All right. So we have sort of the basic effects. We have how many people use it recreationally. We have the harms sort of briefly, and then we cover sort of the history into the current, and then go to the clinical stuff. All right. So psychedelic substances or drugs in general have been used for thousands of years across the globe. for psychedelics, probably most famously in the Amazon, where ayahuasca is brewed, which is a complicated thing where you use two plants that don't grow together and then you make this disgusting thing. But then people have an amazing experience generally. But for Western science, it took until the 1950s or so for psychedelics to really become important. And it was because of this guy, Albert Hofmann, who worked at a pharmaceutical company where he designed medicine. And I think he was trying to design some medicine to stop bleeding in women who were giving birth or something. And then he created LSD. What happened afterwards is I think, very interesting. So he created LSD, and this pharmaceutical company, Sandoz, started sending it out to psychiatrists. I'll cover that in a second. But what happened at the same time when they started to experiment with these drugs is that the drug also got out of the lab and people started to use it recreationally. And they argued, well, this is actually amazing. This is not for medicine, this is for things more... Oh, help. Oh. This is not for medicine only, this is for improving your own life. This is for doing with your friends. This is important for understanding what it means to live and all these kinds of things. So it came very much involved with the counterculture. This is a very, very short history, I must say. And you had this guy, Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which you must know from the movie. And he was actually one of these people who tried psychedelics in a trial, and then he was like, well, this is cool, I need to do this myself outside of a trial. And eventually he started, well, you could say sort of this bus cult, where they took this bus, they had a huge vat of orange juice laced with LSD, and they took LSD every day, and then they drove through America in this bus and convinced other people to also do LSD. This sounds like a joke, right? But it's not. This is true, you can look this up. So psychedelics use got integrated, you could say, with the counterculture and also very much with the Vietnam movement. There was this other guy, Timothy Leary, who was a professor at Harvard, who was setting up his own research lab into psychedelics, but he was also starting to do psychedelics with his students and his employees, which was complicated, you could say. And eventually it got so much cultural backlash that the American government at some point just banned the use of LSD and eventually all psychedelics altogether. So much research was actually performed in that brief period in the 1950s and the 1960s, but then after that it was completely banned and stopped for years. If you want to read more about this, read this book, it is amazing. And after this period where sort of psychedelic use was really criminalized and where scientific use was also stopped because it wasn't allowed anymore. Now about 25 years back or so, we're starting this new period, which people now call the psychedelic renaissance, where people are actually doing more or less the same studies again, but with more modern research methods, but trying to answer more or less the same questions. So these are just a few of the researchers who put it back on the map. And I think Michael Pollan has really popularized it under the broader public with his book, How to Change Your Mind, which is a nice read if you want to get an introductory read about it. Then, and I think very much has changed in those 50 years, where it used to be completely stigmatized with pictures of your brain being fried like an egg if you do drugs, to now it's sort of a normal thing to write about. So these are some excerpts from Dutch newspapers, from the left, from the right, and everyone's talking about psychedelics as medicine, if we should change the laws about it. I like this one, it just says, maybe you should try psychedelics at some point. So it's becoming a more normalized thing to talk about again. Vogue even goes so far to say, could the embrace of psychedelics lead to a mental health revolution? I think this is hopeful, but I don't think it will work like this. And the BBC even writes, the worldview-changing drugs poised to go mainstream. Some people have argued that we should have the people in Israel and Gaza do psychedelics together, and then everything will be solved. I think this is a stupid idea. I don't think that will work. But I'm just saying this to point out how fervently people believe psychedelics can change things. And I think they have a hint of truth there. They are potent things that we can work with and we can make them very useful. But we should also be very, very careful not to oversell them and think they will change everything. And then even people are already sort of analyzing this entire sort of history, you could say, where David Yasin argues, well, we came up with psychedelics again, then everyone's like, this is the most amazing thing ever, this is going to change the world. Then everyone's like, okay, maybe it's not as great as we thought. And now slowly we're on this slope of enlightenment where we can actually do productive research and then hopefully here get some results. Nice picture. Let me just check my time and then I can see how fast I should talk. Okay. So I will briefly cover, I think, the study that really put psychedelics back on the map, and then I will go to the clinical stuff. So Roland Griffiths recreated a study from the 50s where he very simply gave people psychedelics. So he had 36 participants in total. They had them trip in this sort of cozy living room situation, and he either gave them psilocybin, so the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, or on one occasion he gave them Ritalin, methylphenidate, the drug you can take for ADHD symptoms. And they had this comparison, so because Ritalin also produces some bodily effects, and you do very much feel different when you take Ritalin. So if you're naive, you might not realize what drug you have, but obviously after an hour, if you start seeing all this stuff, you might know in which condition you are. So they had people trip. 2 people were present just to guide them through the experience, and they followed them up after 2 and 14 months. So it's a very straightforward design where they just see what happens when people trip and then ask them questions afterwards. And some of the things they said are the following. Some person said, I felt freedom from every conceivable thing, including time, space, relationship, self, etc. It was as if the embodied me experienced ultimate transcendence, even of myself. I think this sounds pretty profound. I don't really know what it means. And I think this is a recurring issue in psychedelic experiences where it feels very, very meaningful to people and they give very much meaning to it. But when they try to explain what the meaning is, it's not always that clear to understand, right? So when I read this, then I can take some stuff out of it, which I feel when I take psychedelics, this is more or less what I would say. But of many things, I would say I'm not sure what this means at all. So this is a complication that occurs. I'll skip this one. More importantly, I think, in addition to sort of how people talk about the trips, they asked a few things about how meaningful was the experience. I think this is really a fascinating finding, where people say, so you see here that after 2 months, people, I think this is about 70% together, say it was either the single most meaningful thing that has ever happened to me, or it was in the top 5 most meaningful things that have ever happened to me. And people compared it to things like getting a baby or getting married. And this is weird, I would say, because you are a person, you get invited to this university study and you're interested in the topic. You sit down with people you don't really know, you take a substance, you are high for 6 hours, and then after that you say, this was one of the most important things that has ever happened to me. That doesn't usually occur, right? There's not instances of things of which we then say, this is the most important thing. Usually these things build up over time. So you build up a relationship, you fall in love, you get married, you have kids. It's something that's relational generally and builds up over time. But here it's all happening in this short period of 5 hours. So this is a bizarre finding, I think, and something that shows us how potent they can be. They followed these people up, not just after 2 months, but also after about a year. And then they still report the same thing, right? So it's not sort of, they did it yesterday and they feel amazing about it, but a year later they report the same. Not only meaningful, but they also say it's one of the top 5 most spiritually significant experiences. And this becomes more complicated because what does spiritually significant mean for different people? But if you take it more concretely, they also reported an increase in current personal well-being or life satisfaction due to the experience. And then in addition to asking people themselves, they also had friends and family report on positive behavioral change, and there they find more or less the same thing. So it seems to be the case that if you take psilocybin in a sort of confined setting, you could say, then it might entail increased personal well-being. And again, this is a small study, and there's many things to still say about it, but it sheds some light on the potency of these substances and how a single experiences of it can have a profound impact on people. All right, so this is more or less what the study that showed that again. All right, one picture, and then we really go to the clinical stuff. I take some more water. You guys still doing good? You're still happy? Okay. You're a bit quiet. It's okay. Okay. So I mentioned clinical psychedelics are not new. We've been actually doing this for 70 years ago or so. As you can see here, LSD was first studied in 1947. Actually, mescaline, another psychedelic, was already identified even in the 19th century. So we know about the substances for a long time, but the research only really started in the 50s. And as I mentioned, Sandoz, this pharmaceutical company for which Albert Hofmann worked, sent it out to psychiatrists. So this is clinical research in the 50s. You develop a drug, you mail it to psychiatrists, and you ask them to see if it works. Right? It's very different now, I must say. But it worked out more or less because they started trying this, and they had positive results, and they started doing actual studies. And just one statistic to point out how big this was. Within 2 decades, several tens of thousands of patients were treated. Right? So it's good to realize that this is not sort of a feeble thing where people did a few small trials and see what happened, but rather many, many people were actually treated in regular clinical programs with LSD. And these tens of thousands of people are very many more than that we have tested now in clinical trials, which is altogether a couple of thousand maybe. Right? So much research was done then. So one question then is, why do we now see this resurgence of research into psychedelics? And I think there's several reasons. The core ones are very straightforward and maybe a little bit demoralizing, but don't worry, it will get better. So about 50% of people will experience a mental disorder at some time in their life, which is a huge number, which means half of you, right? And then the half of you that doesn't get a mental disorder at some point in their time will definitely know some people who do, right? They're hugely impactful in people's lives and in lives of relatives. They're one of the most stringent things we can try to improve in humanity, I think. In addition, about half of those mental disorders begin before age 18. So these are things that happen early in life, generally. It's not like you're old and you get sick and then you also get a depression. No, rather it's something that happens earlier, and it can be debilitating, and it can influence lives on a very long scale. And if you put this in more sort of economic terms, in the sense of how much harm it does, we know that they're the second leading cause of years lived with disability. These numbers are not so important, but just to point out that people suffer from mental disorders, they die earlier from mental disorders, and they have less happy lives because of mental disorders, right? So they're prominent, and they're something we can change and influence, and something we should work on. Now, I'll show you this picture. And this picture visualizes the number of medicine that have been approved for use by the European Medicine Agency in 2023. It's about 90 in total. So you see that we're doing really good work on cancer. There's 23 new medicine. Neurology is doing well, and all these other kinds of things. But there's 0 medicine that are new for mental disorders, at least in 2023. And if you look at the history, let's say the past decades on mental health disorders, then essentially we have not created any new medicine that help with psychiatric issues. And to put that even more bluntly, we're still using the same kind of antidepressants now as we were using 50 years ago. They're essentially the same ones. The only things that we have been able to slightly improve is that the side effects are a little bit less bad, right? But they've not become more effective. We cannot treat more people with it. So it's limited. And this is not to say at all that psychiatric medicine aren't good or not useful. They're definitely useful for particular groups of people. And if you use them wisely, they can greatly improve lives. But psychiatry has been not improving at this end in any case for the past years. And no, I'm not tell this anecdote as well because it will run out of time. This is fine. Okay, so very few new medicine. So people are somewhat hopeful that psychedelics can be a new wave, you could say, for psychiatry, because psychiatry is struggling with treating people medicinally. So that's all the bummer slides. But then the hopeful slide is this one. So this is this psychedelic drug development tracker by Psychedelic Alpha, which is a nice organization that does all kinds of things in the psychedelic landscape. And they keep track of all the trials that are being done in the psychedelic landscape. So in the outer ring, you see discovery and preclinical. So that's discovering new trials and seeing if they don't kill mice. Then phase 1 is sort of this bluish thing. So these are actually giving the medicine to humans. And then phase 2 is giving the medicine to people with particular conditions. And then phase 3 is the larger trials where you treat dozens or even hundreds of patients with a medicine to see if it can actually be used properly. So as you can see, there is, I haven't counted them, but it's about 100, I think, medicine that are being developed in one way or another. But as you can also see, most of them are in the outskirts, and like the track from here to there is maybe like 20 years or so. It's a long discovery process to actually get something on the market. And yeah, I'll show it in a second. This is the picture I used to get my grant for psychedelic research in adolescents. Okay, so we're now at this point where we are doing very much new research into the clinical use of psychedelics, but what does that actually look like? How do we do this treatment? So to give you an overview, this is what it generally looks like. This is for MDMA, but it's very similar if you look at psilocybin. So what often happens is that there's this preparatory phase, and then there's a treatment phase. And what happens in the preparatory phase is people get prepared for the sessions. So they are explained what the treatment looks like, they get to know their therapists, stuff like this. And in the treatment phase, they actually get sessions with MDMA or psilocybin or some other substance. And what you see then is that there's one MDMA session, which generally is from like 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 in the afternoon or something. It's like a full day at a clinician's office, you could say. And then it's followed by 3 integration sessions where the psychedelic experience is integrated in the rest of the therapy and in the rest of life. So it's a kind of interesting combination of things where you get a psychedelic substance at one point, but then it's interlaced in this regular treatment protocol, you could say. What it looks like is much different from the regular therapy, you could say. This is an example. These are actually 2 of the people who've done most of the therapy sessions in the world, I think. So the idea is that people have these inward experiences where they get to go through their own experiences and then they can talk about it later. So rather than being sort of a directive approach where people talk about the experience a lot, the experiences themselves are very much personal, and then only later do people talk about it more. So this is very different from regular psychotherapy. And the integration sessions are more similar, you could say. So just a few slides to show you what you must already have figured out. So it seems to work. This is for treating depression with psilocybin. This was one of the earliest trials where they had only 12 people. And you see very nicely that people are very depressed at the start. Then they get a high dose of psilocybin. And then within a week, most of them do not score on the depression scale anymore. So these were kind of bizarre findings. These are huge effect sizes. So people start this treatment, and within a week, their depression seems to be gone. And these are not just people, but these are people who were depressed for 10 years or so, right? So quite bizarre findings. But more importantly, this is only 12 people, but now we have larger trials. This is the one of the most important ones for MDMA, where people with PTSD were treated. This is in about 100 people. And then you nicely see where MDMA-assisted therapy, which is the red line, slowly decreases the PTSD symptoms after these 3 sessions. And when they give a placebo with therapy, then it goes down less and slower. All right. Now, basically, all of the stuff I've been talking about is still in the research phase. So most of it is really clinical trials where you only get into in particular instances. But there's a few exceptions in the world where actually, more generally, psychedelic therapy is becoming accessible. So Switzerland has this weird history with psychedelics because they were developed there. And there's actually a particular list of therapists in Switzerland who are allowed to work with psychedelics at their own discretion. So they have to argue why they want to use it with a particular patient, but then they can. And in the past 10 years or so, about 1,800 people have been treated this way, which is actually quite a big number. And stupidly enough, I have no idea why no one has come up with this, but they didn't measure stuff. I would say if you do this, then at least have them do some questionnaire to take care of what's going on, but there's bad data on this. This is a gold mine if anyone ever gets good data on this. In Canada, there's also sort of a special access program, but it's much more complicated. It takes more time, and it has to come from the patient, not from the therapist. But about 300 applications have been approved so far, but these people have not all been treated yet. And in Australia, MDMA and psilocybin are actually legal to use clinically, but they were sort of ahead of the pack, so it is allowed, but there's hardly anyone capable of delivering the treatment yet. So they have sort of this very weird logistical problem, you could say. And also, we just have still quite little input on how to do this best, so we need to know more about this. In the United States, the FDA recently rejected MDMA as a medicine, which was a great disappointment, I think, to the field in general, because people really expected it to be approved. But arguably, there's good sides of this as well. As I mentioned, I think much is still to learn, much infrastructure is still to be set up, and much training to therapists still needs to be done. So hopefully we can do this now before an actual approval occurs. And then in Europe, there's this organization actually working with the EMA, the European Medical Agency, to try and work out how to get MDMA and eventually psilocybin legalized as a medicine in Europe. But this will all still take years. So yeah, the progress is still long, you could say. And if we look at this from a different perspective, not so much the countries, but the substances, then there's a slight irony. I talked at the beginning of what we talk about when we talk about psychedelics. So ketamine, which arguably is the least of the psychedelics, you could say, if you look at what it does in the brain and how it functions experientially, is actually the only one that is completely approved, basically across the globe. And it is becoming increasingly available as a treatment for depression and for suicidality. Then MDMA, which is also classically not a psychedelic and works differently in the brain, is actually the one that is furthest ahead, for which we have the best evidence that it does really seem to work to treat PTSD. And I'm quite positive that in the next few years or so, we will see this also legally. And then psilocybin is really the first true psychedelic, you could say. But here the trials are actually less hopeful, so there's still good effects, but not as large as for MDMA and not as constructive as for MDMA. So I think it will still take time for this to develop. And one issue here is that for MDMA, we have much better reason why it works compared to the reasons we have for why psilocybin would work. We don't really know what the working mechanisms are there. We can talk about that more if you're interested. And then there's tons of other substances that people are looking at, which I'm not going to talk about, but there's many. Okay, I'm about to wrap up, I think. A few more slides. So I've said many very positive things about psychedelics, and that is for good reason. I think they can be very useful. I think they can be meaningful. They can be personally informative and interesting. Clinically, I think they can be relevant, and much research is still to be done and to be discovered. But there's also a huge need, I think, to be critical of the entire enterprise and what it does and doesn't mean. I already mentioned the idea that we can change the world or completely change people's minds with psychedelics. I don't think it would work like that. So just a few critical notes to sort of wrap it up with. So first, even though we're doing better and better research and more research, there's still plenty of methodological limitations. Now, most of these are common to science in general, just because we only have limited funds and we can only do so many trials. But we really need larger sample sizes, we need better control groups, and we need to know what happens on the long term. It's great that people do better after half a year or maybe a year, but suppose they are depressed or they recur in their PTSD symptoms again a year later, then it might not be worth it to do this very expensive and long-term therapy. There's this huge blinding problem, right? If you give people LSD, they will know at some point. So you have these expectation and placebo effects, which we cannot really control for. We should work this out. And I think my most important point, and one that I think many psychedelic researchers and many psychedelic enthusiasts dislike me for pointing out, is that I think that many researchers are really biased towards favoring psychedelics. I think the core reason why people get into the psychedelic field is because they took psychedelics, they thought, this is fucking amazing, I should research this, right? It's a little bit simplistic, and they have, of course, good ideas with this, but there's this strong sense of meaning, of urgency, right? They have a connection with the substance, you could say. This is not a problem per se. It is often the case that people who research depression have had a history with depression, or they know people who are depressed and therefore they find it so interesting, and this might bias their thinking as well. But in psychedelics, there's huge subcultures that have all kinds of bizarre beliefs about reality, which they very much relate to psychedelics. And I think we should be very, very careful of not conflating these things and ensuring that we're doing proper science and drawing right conclusions, rather than having people, sort of look for the stuff they think is right to begin with, right? All right. And then, and finally, I haven't talked about this so much, but there's this, the meaningfulness that it gives to people individually can also very much bias their meaning giving to the psychedelic substance. And here too, this is a tricky thing where, if people report this is fucking amazing, that's not to say that it's always fucking amazing, right? We need to figure this out in other ways. We need to objectively assess things. And only then can we really figure out for what purposes we can and cannot use these substances. All right, I have this beautiful slide that's very critical, but I think I will skip it. It's interesting, but it's a lot to talk about. And I will wrap up with these challenges. So I think the science is progressing, and it's progressing better and better, I think, but it still faces sizable challenges. I think most of these are just challenges for science in general, but I think some of them are more pertinent and more explosive, you could say, for the psychedelic science scene. I think some of these issues are unresolvable in principle. Like, I don't think we will solve the blinding problem by figuring out some substance that actually blinds it, but rather we need to come up with new ideas to actually deal with these issues, try and control for things, or figure other ways out to analyze the data. And perhaps most importantly is that scientists are just people. They just come up with ideas and then they try to figure out whether they're correct or not, but they're not really smarter in any other way. And you see this in the psychedelic science scene, but in science in general, and it's good to take note of. Okay, thank you very much.
So you guys are very polite. Are you already having audio? Yes, okay. So now it's time for the second part of this event, which is the Q&A session, as you can see by this very casual environment that we've created here. So before we open it up to questions, which I'm sure you all have a lot of questions after that very nice overview about psychedelics and their different applications, we think it's always very valuable to also just ask, about what is the actual daily practice like of working with psychedelics, right? And instead of it being this very abstract thing, right? Psychedelic science being this sort of international, effort in trying to understand these substances. And we happen to have someone in the room who actually works, right, within psychedelic science. So to make that a bit more concrete, right? What does that actually look like? So I actually kind of first wanted to ask you, Josjan, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what actually initially drew you to psychedelics and maybe how that influenced your career path in the end. Like, how did you end up working with psychedelics professionally?
Yeah, so I'm very much guilty of also just having tried psychedelics myself and finding them very interesting. So I think I first took psychedelics when I was 20 or so, and that was quite fabulous. And since then I've been using them regularly. And initially when I started in science, I had nothing to do with psychedelic research. I did a PhD that was more neurobiological. I did MRI imaging in guys with a criminal background. So that was very interesting as well, but very different. And when my PhD was almost done, I figured, what do I actually want to study? And I thought psychedelics would be very interesting to figure out how these things actually work. So it was very much from a personal interest that eventually I turned to psychedelic research. Mm-hmm. The change was, well, I figured if I want to do psychedelic research, I need to get to know people who do psychedelic research, which is, I think, the main tip if you want to do research into any topic. Then I figured, how am I going to do this? Because I know none of these people. But I like teaching a lot. So then I figured if I go teach a course on psychedelics, or at least organize a course on psychedelics, then I can invite all the people who do the interesting research, and then I will know them. So this is what I did. So I went to the honors program at the VU and discussed with them my idea to give sort of this overview course of where the science is headed and where we are at, and presented that, and they were actually very optimistic about that. And then from there on, I got to know the field and got to know the people. And then it still took quite a few years to get grant money to actually start the study. But that is now fixed as well. So actually, officially, I'm only getting paid for this since the 1st of January this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, but the way you're describing it now, I mean, it's retrospectively, right? But it was like a conscious effort after having this fabulous experience, which I don't know if you would also rate as a top 5 meaningful experience in your life, or maybe top 10. But it sounds like it was a conscious effort, like this experience, or maybe multiple experiences. This is what I want to be doing, right? In my career, I want to study these things and understand them. Is that true?
Yeah. So it's good to make the distinction that it was still maybe 6 years or so between the first time I used psychedelics and I actually figured out, okay, maybe it's interesting to research this. So it's not that the experience itself drew me to try and figure it out, but rather having had more experience with psychedelics over the course of time, I figured if I want to figure out something of how it works, then this would be a very cool thing to figure out. And it's a little bit arbitrary because when I first started in science, I didn't really have a topic I was particularly interested in. Like, I didn't have a particular interest in antisocial behavior and psychopathy. I mainly just wanted to learn how to image brains and analyze the data. The topic didn't matter. So only after my PhD, I figured what topic would be really interesting, and then this came up.
Right. Right. And so far, have you encountered colleagues in the field who have not used psychedelics and are still working with them?
I've only heard rumors of a few not having used psychedelics, and I'm not even sure if those rumors are true. I would say that probably 99%, if not more, right, people have used psychedelics who work in the field.
Right. Right. And so within APRA, right, so we have a community of, it's mainly students, but I think it's a lot of people, sometimes also professionals, people in the general public that are interested in these substances. And one of the most common questions we get is, what do I need to do, right? How do I get into this field? People are very passionate because for many of them, these experiences are very meaningful to them, right? Mm-hmm. What are some of the more relevant academic disciplines you think you would say, right, with the way things look right now in the field? What would be relevant to have as a background if you want to work with psychedelics, either in research or therapeutically?
Yeah, so I think there's very many avenues, and I don't think there's one particular way you should try and go for, which would be most useful. So one way is to organize a course. That worked. I can recommend, but I'm not sure how much room there is for other ones. I think, like in the type of study you would do, there's broad possibilities. You can do psychology or medicine or more neurobiology. And depending on what kind of thing within the field you'd like to study. There's also people coming in from physics or computational science or neuroscience more broadly. So there's really tons of way to get into the field, I think. I think what would be more relevant is trying to figure out a little bit what parts of it are you interested in. So let's say if you want to do research really into the clinical aspects, then therapeutic backgrounds are useful, or just psychological backgrounds in general. But if you want to do more sort of the hardcore brainy stuff, then that's really useless and you better do something else. But I think psychedelics itself is also in this case more or less just the topic, you could say, but you need to grasp and master the methods really to do good research, I think. So depending on what kind of research you want to do should be more leading, I think, than that you're interested in psychedelics.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's kind of in line with the advice that we generally give, right? Because people can also sometimes get a bit of a tunnel vision saying, this is the end goal. I want to be a psychedelic therapist. I want to work with psychedelics in neuroscience. And so it would kind of be good advice if you're going to be a psychologist, learn psychology, right? Learn about therapy, learn about these basic concepts before just diving into this very particular career path that might not be attainable at this point.
Yeah, I'd say that's generally good advice. There's now, I think in the UK, there's the first Master of Psychedelic Science in Exeter.
In Exeter, yeah.
So I'm really curious how that's going to pan out, because there's not going to be jobs for all these people in psychedelic science, right?
No, so you have a diploma, and then what?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, okay. And what about if you don't necessarily have a relevant academic background? You're just very interested in psychedelics, and you want to work with them either professionally, maybe in a coaching capacity, right? Like what options do people really have?
I mean, for coaching, it's like the Wild West. You can just do it. I know several people who do this. They just started up a company and they now coach people.
And anyone here, by any chance? No, doesn't seem like it. No. Or they don't want to share. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. It really depends also here on what path you'd like to go, I guess. So coaching is sort of available to everyone. Working with psychedelics generally, I think, like at this point, it's more or less you can do some research and you can be involved in clinical trials. And then there's all the gray stuff like coaching, you could say, and maybe organizing retreats. But if you really want to work in the more sort of clinical field, then you will need to have some education that relates to it. And I think in the next, let's say 10 years or so, this is really going to professionalize, and there's going to be more clear standards on who might be licensed to work with psychedelics, for example. Right,
yeah. Yeah, and I want to get to that point next, right? About, you're saying the next 10 years, what might the future hold? But I was still kind of curious about your own day-to-day experience, right? And because you mentioned a little bit about this new trial that you're working on with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD within adolescents, right? Could you just give us a bit of an impression, like what kind of challenges are you running into when you want to set up a trial like that, right? Because I can imagine like the logistics, ethical considerations, money, always money.
Yeah,
right?
Money
like
is on the top, the worst one.
Yeah, what are some of the challenges you're running into when you want to do something like this?
Yeah, so here I would argue that maybe it's not even so particular to psychedelic science, but rather if you want to do a clinical trial, it's just terrible. There's so many rules and so many things you have to take care of. I mean, that's a good thing, but it's a lot of work. And, this has to do with planning everything, doing logistics, but also in this case, if you do a study with a medicine that has not yet been approved, then you need to find someone who creates the medicine. And it's ridiculously expensive. I think we have to pay like 30,000 euros to treat 12 patients. Right, that's the cost for the MDMA alone.
30,000 for the MDMA.
Yeah, for the MDMA.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
So that's challenging, and I'd say for psychedelics particularly classically when you do a study into medicine, you have someone who is sick, and then you give them a medicine and you check if they're better, right? That's more or less how it works. And so let's say if someone has an infection and you give them antibiotics, then the antibiotics will just do the job and you're done. But psychedelics in particular are not designed or not thought to work like this. So, you don't just give them to the patient and then you wait and see, but rather it's integrated in this entire therapeutic protocol. And I think one of the things that are very limitedly developed yet is how to figure out the best therapeutic protocol. So there's this MAPS protocol, the company that did most of the research so far, and people use this, but there's very vague phases in the entire protocol. So stuff like that is really complicated to still get improved, you could say.
Right. Yeah, so and I feel like you really tried to give a balanced view in your talk, right? Like, of course, starting with some of the very hopeful, very optimistic side of things, and then there's all these challenges that you describe. So considering, right, all of these different, very highly effective interventions with psychedelics, something psychedelic is happening right now. Very good. But considering all of these challenges, but also the very hopeful side of things, like where do you kind of see the field developing, let's say, the next 10 to 15 years, right? Are we looking at a mental health revolution, as some claim, or is it going to be something of a smaller scale? Like if I had to ask you to make a bit of a prediction in the Netherlands or Europe.
Yeah, of course, very risky predictions, but I'll try. So I'd say it's not going to have a huge impact in the next 10 to 15 years. I'm hopeful that at least MDMA for PTSD will professionalize and be regulated in some way within that time frame, at least for adults. And it's good to realize that, for many psychiatric disorders, we do have treatments that work for many people. Right? It's not that we are sort of completely in the dark and we don't know what to do. So it's not that we need to find treatments that work in some way, but we need to find treatments that preferably work much better than the stuff that we already have. And MDMA definitely has potential in this sense, but probably for at least half of PTSD patients, MDMA therapy will not be more effective than just regular therapy we have now, because it's already effective enough, right? And then if you consider that regular therapy is a lot less time-consuming, a lot less costly, then it's not going to change how therapy will work for most people, I think. So figuring out what group would be most helped and where it is most viable to work into, those are huge questions for which we just don't really have good answers yet. So I think we will see a change where it becomes available for more people, but it's not going to be a first-line treatment anytime soon, I think.
Right. So it's going to be moving in some productive, positive direction, but it might not quite be the revolution that some people are expecting or hoping for.
Yeah, and I do think that one important thing that I think that people are not talking about so much, how psychedelic therapy might change psychiatry or psychology more broadly, is that we're trying to do therapy in a different way, you could say, when using these substances. So it's not just giving this substance and putting people in an altered state, but also trying to figure out how to deal with that in the best way we can. And I do think that we might have sort of unexpected uses just for regular therapy, which we haven't figured out yet, that we will figure out because we're trying this new type of therapy. So I think that we might learn stuff from, let's say, MDMA therapy for regular practice, and also the other way around. I think we are integrating regular practice much too little in MDMA therapy at this point.
Right.
So integrating those would be a huge step as well.
Yeah, kind of cross-pollinating a little bit. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I have just one final question before we open it up to the audience. I still kind of have, in the back of my mind, people listening to this that are really enthusiastic about psychedelics and want to work with them. Like when you mentioned kind of starting out, right, with this curiosity yourself, you wished you could find a place where you could meet people, right, and connect with them. Would you say that you wished there was something like the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research Association back then, or that you would recommend people to join an association like that?
I mean, when I started teaching the course, I actually got in touch with APRA as well. And I was a member. Maybe I still am a member, actually. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I pay my monthly fees anymore.
You're welcome to join.
Yeah, I will rejoin, I think. So APRA is definitely a useful place. So that's one more informal, you could say. And then if you're into science, it's really the conferences. So the Open Foundation is really useful. They have this 2-yearly conference, ICPR. And getting to know people who work in the field is just generally very useful.
Right.
Yeah, and whatever way you can produce that is good.
I think that's a great endorsement.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so I think we're going to open it up to the audience. We have 2 mics and 2 helpers in the room who can hand you a mic. I'm sure some of you might have some questions for Josjan. Yeah, over there. Okay, there's a mic coming your way.
Thanks. One of the topics I missed is if you could explain the underlying mechanisms in terms of what's making it work, the why.
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So I'd say that for MDMA, for PTSD, we have some very good indications of why it is that the substance is useful. I have slides on this, but no, I'll leave them. So you could say one thing that MDMA does is just reduce anxiety. Another thing that MDMA does is it makes it more easy to remember things. And what it does is it makes you much more social. And all these aspects are particular things that people with PTSD struggle with. So if you sort of make it very simple, then sort of classically what happens with PTSD is you are traumatized by some particular event, and then you re-experience the event in other situations, and this is debilitating. So let's say you were in a car accident, which was horrible, and then afterwards you cannot drive in a car anymore, but then you feel so scared you also cannot sit in a car anymore, and then you cannot ride a bus anymore because that's already too emotionally overwhelming, and it just keeps going down like this, right? So your emotions are too strong for regular situations, you could say. So the idea then is that if you take MDMA, then you can think about the trauma again without being overwhelmed by these negative emotions. And then if you're capable of doing that during the MDMA sessions, then it becomes more easy to think about the trauma again when you're sober, because you sort of you reconsolidate the memory with sort of more neutral emotions, you could say. And what's nice about this is actually a process that happens normally in people. Like we know that when people experience something that is bad, then they will feel scared for a long time after it, but it will slowly dissipate. And this is normal and healthy and very evolutionarily understandable. But in PTSD, this process seems to dysfunction, you could say. And with MDMA, it seems you can more easily get into that mode again. And there's let me just give that example. And the other example, which is very important, is that you're more social and you trust people more easily. And the best predictor for treatment is your relationship with your therapist. So if you can improve that by giving MDMA, then you're already likely to see better effects. So those two things combined are very important in that sense. And there's more neurobiological mechanisms underlying it as well, for which we also have some evidence that they work that way. So there's at least good reasoning and some common sense things that really indicate what might work with MDMA. So that's optimistic. But then if we shift to psilocybin or more classical psychedelics, there it becomes much vaguer. So there you more or less say, well, you sort of reevaluate things, you change the way you think about yourself, you reappraise your beliefs, but we don't know why psychedelics would do that or how psychedelics do that. And the experience itself can be very, very different between people. It can be at times be amazing and the best thing you ever experienced. And at other points, it might be completely terrifying and the worst thing you ever experienced. So it's quite unclear how this sort of mixed bag of stuff going on will lead to improvements in, let's say, depression. And I think we're, like scientists are, I think, selling it a little bit too much as if it's working in a particular way and we just need to test it to see if it actually works clinically. I think especially with psychedelics, we need much more research into why it works and what are the mechanisms. Also to figure out if there might not just be easier ways to use those.
Yeah, in the back.
I wanted to ask, because you said, and it's obvious that psychedelics can generate changes in mental states. But I wanted also to ask about, to put it somehow, physical changes in the brain, because it can sort of affect neuroplasticity and generate new connections between neurons. And I have gone over some articles that speak about also like DMT, especially regulating neurogenesis in adults. I don't know what you can tell us about that, like more the physical aspects in the brain after a psychedelic experience.
Yeah, so we know, at least from in vitro studies, so like studying neurons in like fluids, you could say, that if you put psychedelics in there, then they will form many more connections. So in principle, it's very clear that there's a direct effect of psychedelics influencing this process, which is optimistic in the sense that this is useful for changing connections or rewiring the brain. We actually don't have so much strong evidence yet that this is also actually happening in a living brain rather than like in a dish. But there are some studies indicating this, and I think there's sort of fair reason to reason that way, and we'll see in the future how that develops. There's a few labs really doing sort of hardcore neuroscience into figuring this out, and it's promising, I think, but it's also somewhat early stages. And I do highly doubt that our explanations for how it works will be better on a neurobiological level than on a psychological level. I think it'll be much easier or much more natural to try and explain what is going on via the experience and via the psychological effects than via the neurobiological mechanisms. And that's not to say that it's not fundamentally neurobiological, it's just different levels of explanation. But I don't think that that will be the route that's going to explain more fastest. And your final thing on DMT regulating something, I don't know.
I was more aiming to not just taking psychedelics for treating specifically mental disorders like PTSD, but I have also read some trials or studies on maybe neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. So I'm curious about that. Yeah. So I'm less familiar with this literature, and it's also much smaller, and just we know less about it yet. But indeed, for neurodegenerative diseases, it's being investigated, and also for something like cluster headaches. There too, I have no idea what the reasoning is that it works, but people think so, and there's research into it. One way that people have suggested that this might work is that there's actually some psychological part that relates to the experience of the neurodegenerative diseases, and especially with headaches, for example, and that you might be sort of using that pathway. But there must be some biological thing going on as well that would explain it. But I know little about it. I can't really answer your question so well.
There was actually, just to add on to that, I think just 2 weeks ago, a first study in psilocybin in Parkinson's disease, I think a relatively small trial where they didn't just see strong improvements in depression, but actually also in the motor symptoms, right? Like the movements, which is of course one of the core features of Parkinson's disease, difficulty moving, where I think the researchers also argued that it might be a very complex interplay between mind and body, right? So that this division between the body and mind is also, of course, not as rigid as we tend to think. But there's definitely some stuff happening there.
Yeah, and perhaps to add still is that, so with like Parkinson's disease, we have a better sense of what is wrong in the brain, right? What's broken. So, medicine classically, and I think still ideally, figures out what is the problem and what can we use to fix this problem, right? So, for example, with diabetes, you just use insulin to fix the sugar balance, and then it fixes the problem. So it's very clear how the mechanism works. And with Parkinson's and other diseases like this, we have a better sense of what's wrong biologically. So it's also easier to figure out what mechanism to work on. But in psychiatry, we don't know the mechanisms. We are terrible at that so far, right? We have this idea that serotonin is problematic in depression, but there's really bad evidence that this explains things. It's much more complicated and much more ingrained in personal lives, in societal relations. So it's much harder to find this direct connection in psychiatry. Yep.
Thank you for your presentation. That was my question. So I'll ask another question. I was curious, as a phenomenologist and cognitive scientist, what you think about the boundary between self and world and other, because as we saw in the video of the woman, she had a bit of difficulty describing the experience to the other person. But it seemed like she was more connected on the level of self and world. And you see similar things in people with schizophrenia. And I was wondering, do you think at some point psychedelics could be used to simulate these type of experiences in order to understand this phenomenon in schizophrenia better?
Yeah, very interesting question. So when psychedelics were first being studied, this was actually much more of a prominent thing where people suggested if you give people psychedelics, you're basically inducing a psychosis so that we can study what that is like. And I mean, the reasoning is fair. There's clear overlap between psychedelic experiences and psychosis. However, there's also a very extreme difference, and that is that people almost always, when they're high on psychedelics, still know that they are high on psychedelics, right? They can differentiate that what they're experiencing now is not the real world, or at least they're experiencing the real world in a different way. So only if that boundary breaks, you could say it would be, I think, like a psychosis in that sense. So that was the first idea. And then for a very long time, people sort of tried to hush this a little bit because they didn't want to relate psychedelics to schizophrenia too much. It sounds very dangerous. And I think more recently, it's not a huge topic, but people are suggesting it again, like maybe we can see how this works. So I think there's definitely potential there, but hard to say how it would develop particularly. I was going to say one smart thing, but I forgot now. Wait, can you what was the first part of what you said? It will jar my memory, I hope.
About the woman describing her experiences.
Oh, yes. Okay, that was enough. So
This better be smart.
Yeah, I hope so. I feel smart. So a few points that are important, I think. The first is that she has a hard time explaining it, and the communication is complicated. And people argue that this is ineffability, so it's impossible to describe the experience in words and to communicate it to another person. I think this is very pessimistic and bad science. I think it makes no sense why it would be impossible. Why would anything be impossible? I think principally it's already very, very hard to explain anything to someone else, what you are experiencing, right? If I'm experiencing you as a group of people now, how am I going to explain to you what that feels like? It's really complicated. But I can do my best and we can probably get to some point. I think with psychedelics it's the same, it's just more complicated because the experience is further off from our general experiences. But I think this is really a quantitative problem rather than a qualitative problem. So I think this is quite a fundamental issue, I think, in trying to understand what is going on. That is my first smart thing. The second thing, not sure if that's smart, but it's good too, I think, is this division between self and other. So I'm not sure if the lack of communication really shows this division more or less. But I think it's a very prudent topic to talk about because it is an experience that people very much talk about, that they feel either much unity with themselves or with nature or with the whole of the universe, for example. But here too, I think we need to be quite thoughtful of what that actually means. So for example, when people do research, they ask very weird questions about this. Like, I'm not sure if when they ask you, did you feel at whole with the universe? Like, to me, that's a weird question. I mean, I generally feel at whole with the universe, I think. I mean, I realize that I'm part of the universe, and I don't know, that it has, So this feeling must mean something else, I think, to people. But we're not very specific about what it means to what person in what instance. So being specific about what it means is important. And I hope that if we be more specific about that things, then we can try to relate it better to what is going on. This was a very convoluted way to not talk about schizophrenia. I hope I answered your question a little bit.
So you would say that some of the difficulties in trying to understand psychedelic experiences are the same difficulties that exist in trying to understand conscious experience in general.
Yeah, I think they're exactly the same problem.
They're exactly the same problem,
yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering about your study with adolescents and what your ideas and thoughts are of bringing psychedelic treatment to under the age of 18 and the complications with that, and even maybe with what you've had to go through in getting approval for that.
Yeah. So first, we're not approved yet. We have the money though, so that's a good first step. We are applying for approval, I think, next month or so. But we can start on that track. I think there will not be a principal problem with getting approval because we're studying adolescents with treatment-resistant or PTSD. And I mean, they are children who are really suffering for a very long time, who've tried different treatments and it's not working, right? So they're at a horrible point and we literally don't know what to do. So having a new treatment that has optimistic outcomes is, I think, very realistic and is in principle what we always do when we try to study new medicine. So I don't think there's a big difference in studying a new medicine in general and a new medicine that is psychedelic, right? So in that sense, I'm not really concerned. There is, I think, still a lot of stigma about using drugs in general, and people are worried that in adolescence this might be a bigger problem. I'm very curious how the ethical committee, whether they will talk about these things or not so much. I don't think that is so much of a problem per se. What I think is more challenging is that the therapy so far has been devised for adults, and adults are just not the same as adolescents. So figuring out what to change in the treatment is, I think, very important. And there, I am definitely not the expert. I'm really doing the research. And we have a team of therapists and a professor of clinical psychology, or a professor of psychiatry, and a professor of psychology, actually, who are together working on the treatment protocol and adapting it to the adolescent situation, you could say. So one thing that comes into play there is more involvement of parents or other people who are important in their lives. Another thing is that we're going to try to make the sessions shorter. So rather than be high for 8 hours, maybe be high for 5 hours to make it a little bit more bearable, you could say. And generally, we try to have shorter therapy sessions with adolescents. So these are a few of the aspects that are relevant. And then, as I mentioned, this MAPS protocol is quite vague at points. I think generally they should be systematically become more clear. But this is also the case for the treatment in adolescents, and really trying to get the therapists to work in as many of the things that we already do know that work within trauma therapy to also include them in the formal therapy for the MDMA study. Did that answer your question?
It did, yes.
Okay.
Could I maybe ask another follow-up question? Because the ethical board is one thing, right? But I can also imagine that there might be some sort of communication strategy also to the outside world, if there is one, because there might be a bit more public backlash when it comes to this particular topic.
Yeah.
Are you going to be, if it all goes through, right, actively sharing this with media, for example, that you're going to do this? Is that already kind of thought out?
We're still working on it. It's not very clear-cut yet. I think principally we will share it once the study is over because I think it's very relevant, both if it works and if it doesn't work. I talked to Rick Doblin about this, and he was he was comparing it to when we started doing cannabis research. So cannabis research is quite normal now. It's used for like pain reduction and different kinds of things. And he said it was terrible to do cannabis research for years and years because everyone hated it. But then they did one study in children with cancer, and then it worked, and then everyone was happy. Right. So I think there might also be a sort of positive side to this, that if it works in children, then it's okay.
Could be a similar sort of effect.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. Ketamine is approved as an antidepressant for treatment-resistant depression, I think now only, but it can also be prescribed off-label by psychiatrists. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you see any opportunities for the development of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, because now if it's approved as an antidepressant, but just mostly pharmacologically seen, but there's in the US there's a lot of ketamine clinics. There's also some in Europe, but you don't see it as much in the Netherlands. So do you know why that is, and do you see any opportunities there?
So ketamine clinics in the States is generally you can make an appointment with a psychiatrist. You agree you have a depression. You go to the ketamine clinic, you get ketamine, you're there for an hour and a half, and then you go home again. It's a very straightforward process, and a little bit weird that it works that way. Why I think it's different in the Netherlands is because we don't have this bizarre healthcare system where everything is super expensive. So generally people don't find their way into healthcare privatized, but just via the regular routes, you could say. I do think it's starting to come up in the Netherlands as well, but I think a little bit more careful, you could say. And one thing there is that I think there's more appreciation here that you need to guide people through these experiences rather than just let them sit and see what happens. I do think that there's going to be a place for this. I think there is already, I think, a place for ketamine, especially for sort of acute problems like acute suicidality. It seems to be quite effective, but it's hard to study and see the long-term results. And for depression, we will have to see. So far, it seems that you need to do it on more or less a regular basis. So let's say every 6 weeks or so. But arguably that's fine. You just take ketamine every 6 weeks, and your depression is sort of doable. I do think it'll be very interesting to see how it will be developed as sort of a ketamine-assisted therapy. And just like a financial complication is there that we can already use it without therapy, and it's more expensive to do it with therapy. So there's not really much sort of economical pressure to start doing this. So I think the advantage of ketamine is we can easily study it because it's already approved, and then off-label it's easy to work things out. But the disadvantage is that also makes it easier to do it in sort of the old school way rather than in a way that, well, arguably is better.
I think we have time for one final question, but we also, I should mention, have booked some tables at the cafe if people want to continue the conversation. So maybe you can still ask Josjan some questions.
I'll be there.
Anyway, so he's going to be there. So, but for now, here in the room, one final question. I don't know who was first. Honor system. Who was first? There's one hand raised over here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Oh. Now 2 people have the mic. It's a battle. Okay, it's a battle.
Please ask your question.
Whoever starts speaking first. Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. And thank you for the data that you shared. I think you shared very important data about the safety profiles, about comparing a lot of these things. And please correct me if I get any of the details wrong, but just to recap some of the main ones. Psilocybin, I think, was the safest one on the list. With regards to the top 5 most meaningful experiences, I know psilocybin kicked the hell out of Ritalin. I don't think anyone... That was the most interesting thing to me about that slide, is that Ritalin had 0 people saying it was the most significant. And then lastly, you mentioned, and you showed the chart for depression, saying that I think we don't fully understand the mechanisms for reducing depression with psilocybin, but that it really kicked major ass. I'm very hopeful about it as being a very underutilized and undertapped tool for fighting depression and, of course, a lot of other things. I know MDMA has the spotlight for PTSD. One thing that I wanted to mention, because you said that we still have many years of research ahead of us. 5 years ago, there was this article from New Atlas that said psilocybin therapy is, and this was 5 years ago, 4 times the efficacy rate of current antidepressants as of 5 years ago. So I'm very hopeful about this as a silver bullet, but I'm very mindful of what you wrote about the psychonauts fallacy. And I'm an analytics manager professionally, and so I try to be data-based in my thinking. And so I want to balance my hopefulness without falling for any sort of fallacious thinking. Curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so maybe to take the statistics that it's 4 times as effective, that's actually the slide I showed with the extremely large effect sizes. So now in the larger scale studies where, let's say, maybe 100 people are treated or so, there we see much smaller effect sizes, which are still slightly higher than what we see in therapy generally, but are much more in the sort of normal spectrum of effect size, you would say. It's also good to realize that when you do a study, a clinical study or scientific study, you will always get better results than in the real world. One reason is that because scientists are sort of checking if the clinicians are doing everything right, so the clinicians do better work. And it's a particular group of people you're studying, right? So you're selecting everyone and you're seeing if it works for them. But then if you start to generalize across the population, then things generally change. And also people just don't adhere to the therapy as well in the real world as in studies. So this also suggests that if the effect sizes are large now, they're still going to go down when we start implementing it more broadly. So these are all limitations. And generally, I'd say there's just really not enough evidence yet, especially for psilocybin, to be too, to draw too strong conclusions. There's just little data in the sense of how many people have been treated. So we really need to up the numbers and then see how it goes. So that's the one part. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the mechanisms are so unclear. But I do think that if we can clarify that and understand them better, then there's also a possibility that the effect sizes will improve further as we start to understand better what we are actually trying to do.
All right, thank you very much, Josjan. So I think that kind of concludes the Q&A and also this portion of the event. So I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and of course you, Josjan, for being here all the way from Rotterdam. 2.5 hours of arduous traveling, and yeah, just as a final note, right? You can, if you found your way to this event here today, then maybe you know about APRA, right, via our website or social media. If you want to attend more wonderful events like this and learn more about psychedelics and meet great people, if I do say so myself, then yeah, just consider joining us, joining our events in the future, or stick around for drinks in a moment here across the hallway. We're going to be hanging out. And yeah, but for now, I just want to, again, thank you for coming, and thank you, Josjan, for this wonderful talk. Give a round of applause.